Well, good morning. And again, a thank you to each of you for being here. By having a group with whom to study, I have the context for my continued learning and in this moment sharing of Psalm 32. Psalm 32 is new in the following way. It's the first of the Psalms that recognizes the importance of confession for sin. That is a psalm of repentance, of teshuvah. And so this psalm, Psalm 32, is also part of our Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy. Remarkably, this psalm will have divisions. So structurally, it'll be flagging different moments in this psalm, divided by the word Selah, which we have seen is a word that identifies some kind of musical notation to the choir conductor, but at the same time demarcates phases of a psalm. And in this psalm, there are two distinct phases. The first half is a description of repentance marked by sin and suffering, and then confession. The second half of the psalm, kind of the second half of the psalm, is teaching. There too, it's distinctive to what we've had in the Psalms to this point. It's more like Proverbs, a wisdom literature. And the last comment before I read the psalm is that I misled us. And I say us because I also was misled a bit. In that second part, in one of my books that I'm going to read a little bit from today by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, his translation, I read it before class yesterday, and I was delighted to see God speaking. But as I researched it further, and I will share with you, that I think is very interpretive and not the way I have chosen to interpret the voice of God in this psalm. Rather, I will share with you why I believe it's what we've seen before, and that's the psalmist saying to others in his midst, like the psalm yesterday, let me teach you what I have learned. So it's the psalmist in celebration speaking to others. But I'll analyze that with you, and it's fascinating again to see the opportunities for interpretation in Psalms. This is a happy psalm. It begins with the same word that began Psalm 1, Ashrei, happy. Psalm 1 is happy as the person who doesn't sit with scorners. Here is happy as the person to whom Adonai reckons no iniquity. And then it will say it again. Actually, the first time, happy, transgression was lifted, stray act was covered over. And that's the envelope of this psalm, happiness. Listen to the very end, which will have a word play. You hear Ashrei, the word play is Yishrei, which means upright. So who is happy? Who is Ashrei? Yishrei, the one who is upright. But in that close, there is more of that rejoicing. Simchu v'Adonai. Rejoice, let us rejoice in Adonai. V'gilu tzadikim, and exult, you righteous. V'harninu kol yishrei lev, and sing gladly, all upright in heart. And I'm going to just note, I'm already changing my translation. I wouldn't want to disappoint Eric with constant tweaks in that I initially said, let us be happy in Adonai, but I want to distinguish Simchu from Ashrei. All right, let me read you the psalm, and then I'm going to focus in on, is God speaking, among other things. I entitled this psalm, Happy, Forgiven and Wiser. For David, a teaching, happy, transgression was lifted, stray act was covered over. Happy is the person to whom Adonai reckons no iniquity, and in whose spirit is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away for my roaring all the day. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My sap was turned into the dry winds of summer. Selah. My stray acts I made known to you, and my iniquity I did not cover up. I said, I shall confess my transgressions to Adonai, and you lifted the iniquity of my stray acts. Selah. For this let every devoted person pray to you for a time of finding. Only let not flooding, rushing waters reach. You are a hiding place. You protect me from confinement with the joyous songs of deliverance. You surround me, Selah. Let me instruct you and enlighten you in the way to go. I will advise upon you, is my eye. Be not like a horse, like a mule without understanding, who is adorned with bit and bridle, restrained so as not to approach you. Many are the pains of the depraved, but who trusts in Adonai? Kindness surrounds. Let us rejoice in Adonai and exult, you righteous, and sing gladly, all upright in heart. So it's a shorter psalm compared to yesterday, Psalm 31 with 25. Let me point out a few little things in terms of some choices. One, there are in the first 5 verses a focus on sin, and 3 different words are used for sin. Pesha in verse 1, chata'ah, and you will also have avon, like in verse 5. It gets repeated. Pesha is repeated, and chatat. Verse 5 gets all 3 of these sins. Some rabbis make a distinction between the 3 categories of sin, with chata, an archery term for missing the mark, as the lowest level, which is why I call it stray acts. Avon is the next level, which I translate as transgressions. Others will translate as crooked ways. And pesha seems to be traditionally the highest level, sometimes translated as, I translate as iniquity as avon, and pesha as transgressions, some translated as crime. And so in this first 5 verses, there's a repetition. You'll get 8 times these words used for wrongdoing, and you won't hear it afterwards. So from after verse 5 and after the confessional, you don't hear any word of sin or wrongdoing, but it's clearly the focus in these first 5. Interestingly, in verse 1, the Hebrew is in the passive, nesui pesha. So I translate it as transgression was lifted, stray act was covered over. And that goes with the sense of happy with this passive dimension, almost as if that is past. That's no longer active in my life. And then verses 1 and 2 are kind of the introduction that focus again on this quality of ashrei, translated here as happy. So I noted it's the beginning of all the Psalms, but as we've seen, ashrei in Hebrew conveys contentment and calm. So it's an inner quality of contentment and calm rather than the happiness of having had a good meal as such. Happy is the person to whom Adonai reckons no iniquity. God doesn't think anymore, yachshov, about his wrongdoing. Ve'ein brucho remiyah, and whose spirit is no deceit. So they go together, as we'll see, because in order for a person to have God no longer looking at one's sin, that person has to be open, straight with God, no deceit, no remiyah. Remiyah, again, is to be a huckster. And now comes the story. So a personal anecdote. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away from my roaring all the day. And here's an interesting poetic play. Verse 3, he's silent and yet roaring, which is to say that he's silent in terms of speech, but inwardly, there's this quality of intense energy and crying out. The word roar is, for instance, in the prophet Amos 3:4 and 3:8. Aryeh sha'ag, a lion will roar, mi lo yirah, who will not be afraid. And so that image of that contrast, here again, he's the sinner and he's keeping silent about it, but somehow within himself, there's a great lion-like stirring of pain. My stray, a lot of people translate roaring as groaning, which is another possibility. But I like the poetic contrast, which I think is what was intended. And now verse 5, his story continues. My stray acts, right, the chatati, those acts that miss the bullseye, often translated as sin, but in Hebrew, again, sin is not a permanent taint as it's used in English, which is part of the Christian vocabulary. Chatat is this lower level of, let me try again because I've missed the bullseye. I made known to you, now he's saying to God, I made known to you, and my iniquity I did not cover up. And again, the word odecha, odiacha, has in it that word we saw yesterday of yodea, of an intimate knowledge that he's now revealed to God. And I did not cover up. And this cover up will be a play that comes into further, because later he's going to ask God to cover up his sins. Actually, it's in the beginning here, verse 1. Kisui chata'a, you covered up my sins. And here in verse 5, but I did not cover up to you. And so here too is a paradox in terms of I'm looking for my sins to be covered over, but I only get that reward when I do not cover up to you. And here's how. I said, and so it's put in quotation marks, I shall confess my transgressions to Adonai, and you lifted the iniquity of my stray acts. And now it says Selah, and verses 6 and 7. He's saying his wisdom. For this, let every devoted person pray to you. He's still talking to God for a time of finding, which is a bit elliptical in terms of finding what. And so commentators will say a time of finding one's own sin or finding the capacity to confess that sin. Probably both are present. Ibn Ezra and Radak would say a time for discerning one's wrongdoing, and then only let not flooding waters, rushing waters reach, which is a metaphor perhaps for danger. Let not danger, my enemies, come rushing toward me like a flood, like a power of which I cannot contain them. Interestingly, Robert Alter sees verse 6 as a scribal error. He sees it as kind of out of place. As a modern decipherer of Psalms, but I kind of see its elliptical nature as part of its power. You know, a time of finding, and then it's a blank, And what is rushing waters? I think that's an emotional expression, not an intellectual expression. And by it being emotional, has an elliptical quality. And now he again is still talking to God. 6 and 7 are between those cellas. You are a hiding place, right? You protect me from confinement or from trouble. That same word that we talked about yesterday, the tsar, the tsuris. With the joyous songs of deliverance, you surround me. So again, a kind of a play on an image of not wanting to be confined out of fear of enemies. You protect me from my troubles, and yet you surround me. I am surrounded, but not by them, but by rejoicing. Songs of deliverance. And then again, Selah. And then it continues. And here's the question. For my beloved teacher, Reb Zalman, he now sees verses 8 and 9 as God speaking. And so he'll say in italics when he translates the psalm, to which God responds, I translate, let me instruct you and enlighten you in the way to go. I will advise upon you is my eye. I will advise upon you is my eye. Be not like a horse, like a mule, without understanding, who is adorned with bit and bridle, restrain so as not to approach you. Let me show you. This is about, right? Okay, 1 second. This is about as sophisticated as I get here technologically. I want to show you my teacher, Reb Zalman. There's my teacher, Reb Zalman, my visit to him in Boulder. As I get ready to quote him, I just wanted to honor him. I'm going to pause to say a word about Reb Zalman. Reb Zalman was born in Vienna, and during the war fled to France as a young man. And there he studied in a Chabad yeshiva. He was of a religious family. And among the people he met as one of his visiting teachers in Marseille, France, was the man who would become the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And when Reb Zalman, during the war, found his way on a boat to America, he went to 770 in Brooklyn at Crown Heights and went to the Chabad Yeshiva. And there at the Chabad Yeshiva, he would stay and he would be ordained as a Chabad rabbi. And he would become the first representative of Chabad to a college campus. In 1950, he was sent with Rabbi Shlomo Karbach to the newly created Brandeis University, a Jewish university, to be representatives of Chabad, and Brandeis would send them away as being too religious for their campus needs. They would remain very close friends, Reb Zalman and Rabbi Shlomo Karbach, the great writer of Jewish music, particularly putting psalms to creative melodies. But Reb Zalman would ultimately leave Orthodoxy. He would not formally, he would leave Chabad. Actually, he would be asked to leave Chabad. He took a congregation, Orthodox congregation in the Boston area. And there he befriended people like the Berrigan brothers. And he also befriended people like Richard Alper, who was a psychology professor doing psychedelics. And Zalman would do LSD, and he would ultimately say that Chabad was too low a ceiling for him, that kind of experience. And his experience, he would earn a doctorate from Boston University, same place that Martin Luther King got his doctorate. In the case of Reb Zalman, on a doctoral dissertation on the Rebbe and counseling, on Yichud. And he would become a creative force in the Jewish community, having passed about 4 years ago. And at the end of his life, He lived in Boulder, Colorado, where he taught at a Buddhist university called Naropa, and he was the founder of what's called the Jewish Renewal Movement. And here's how he sees verses 8 and 9 in his translation of Psalm 32, to which God responds. Actually, let me start from the beginning of Psalm 32 to get a feeling for Reb Zalman and his approach to liturgy. He was a master teacher of what he called Davenology. Here's how he translates at the beginning. Blissful and glad is one who experiences forgiveness, the remission of sins. Blissful and glad is the person whose worst sin is to be at times unmindful of God and who does not fool himself. I suffered in silence, my bones withered as I wept all day long. And so now, to which God responds, let me help you, give you wisdom, show you a way to go, enlighten you a bit, steer you and keep an eye on you. Don't be like a horse or mule, not heeding the rein and bit that urges them to stop. Don't let this happen to you, unquote. So that's his seeing this next phase, verses 8 and 9, as being something we haven't seen in Psalms, which is kind of an oracle, God speaking. He's not the only one. I found one other commentator who I admire, and that's Martin Cohen, Rabbi Cohen. He too sees this as an oracle. Remarkably, while Reb Zalman was very mystical in his orientation, Martin Cohen is not, but he too saw this as God. But here's why Benjamin Siegel, in his commentary, convinced me that it's not the case. Look at verse 9. Be not, it's also kind of elliptical, and there's many different translations for verse 9. Let me just pause to give you a few examples of those different translations. I have in front of you how I translated. Listen to the Jewish Publication Society. Be not like a senseless horse or mule whose movement must be curbed by bit and bridle. Far be it from you. So far be it from you is very different than so as not to approach you. Art Scroll, also very different. Be not like a horse or mule, uncomprehending, restrained with muzzle and bridle when being adorned, to keep them from approaching you. And here's the catch. I've emphasized how in Hebrew there are no capitalizations of pronouns, unlike English, but here's what's different than English, and that is pronouns have a singular or plural tense or formation. Elecha, the last word here, to you, verse 9, is in the plural. So it's not, if you will, God addressing the Psalter, but it's in the plural a lot. Actually, that's the question. And it's mostly understood as being in the plural. And the second problem is, why would God, if God is speaking to this person he's now accepted, be comparing him to a horse or a mule? And so I choose to see instead of verses 8 and 9, which is God speaking, let me instruct you and enlighten you in a way to go. I will advise upon you. You as I be not like a horse, like a mule. The implication of verse 9 being you have free will, unlike a mule or a horse. Use your will wisely. But instead, I see this as wisdom literature. And so the shift is the Psalter, as we constantly see, is sharing with the people around him. There's a need that we have who've gone through all the more something harrowing, that description of his suffering in his sinfulness, to say to others, learn from my lesson. That's the move we constantly see in the Psalms. And that's what I think instead is going on. When he says, let me instruct you, he's talking to somebody else. I will advise upon you. Now, again, here the you can be singular, but he's saying, be not like a horse, right? Use your understanding. Know right and wrong. Unlike the horse and mule that has to constantly be guided, you have choice. Many are the pains of the depraved, but who trusts in now his life learning. Many are the pains of the depraved, but who trusts in Adonai, kindness surrounds. Let us be happy in Adonai and exalt, you righteous, and sing gladly, all upright in heart. So for me, verses 9 to 11 seems like the quote, but the quote of what the Psalter is teaching to others. We have free will. Let us use it wisely. When we are depraved, we are in pain. And what it requires to come out of that suffering is to trust in Adonai. And then we'll feel ourselves receiving God's grace, God's kindness. And that is worthy of singing. But last, he honors his audience when he says, exalt you righteous, sing gladly all upright in heart. My sense is he's in a positive frame of mind, and he sees those around him in the best light as people who are good, as people who are upright, with again that wordplay of yishrei ashrei. If you are upright, then you will experience ashrei, calm contentment. With that, there's a lot of unpacking still that I could do, but let me pause and turn off the screen share so that I can see everybody and gain some of your reactions to this happy psalm, a distinctive psalm in that it's the psalm of confession, of rejoicing, and then of teaching. What are your thoughts? I'm going to take a risk here for myself because I see Ahuva, and I value Ahuva as much more my teacher than mine, hers in Hebrew grammar. Here's a question for you, Ahuva. I can put it up if you need to look. The word to you in Hebrew, elecha and alayich. What can you say about the difference in punctuation? Elecha would be to you in the singular and alayich would be in the plural. Would that be right?
No, they are both in singular.
They're both in singular.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm glad I could ask you, because that eliminates that claim of Benjamin Siegel's that it's in the plural. And again, as a Jerusalem-based rabbi, I lean to him, which is to bring that back. Thank you, Ahuva. Which is to say that there is ambiguity. And that, again, is the power. And so I honor my friend Reb Zalman and Martin Cohen. It could be God speaking to the Psalter, but again, not for that purpose of is it singular or plural, that I correct with Ahuva's help, but rather just for the tone. I think that that if it's God speaking, it's so out of the normal with anything we've seen in Psalms that it makes a lot more sense that he is sharing with others his learning. What do you think of that, Ahuva? Do you have an opinion?
I have to see the text in front of me.
All right, so I'm gonna share the screen one more time just to show Ahuva. And what I'm asking Ahuva is verses 8, you can see it?
Yes.
And 9, where again, you have the alecha in both of them, elecha, to you. And then the rest is many, Rabbi Machovim. Who would you think is speaking, the Psalter or God, and why?
I think it's God.
Okay, good. I like to have differences of opinion. I'm going to take it off just because I want to be able to see you and see everybody. Why do you think it's God speaking?
Because God has the wisdom
Hmm.
to teach, to guide, to enlighten. I think that's what God is saying.
And I will add, we have heard God's voice before, one of the earlier Psalms, though I imagined it then as more of a bibliodrama, which was the Psalter imagining God's response,
Well, exactly, exactly. That's right.
rather than God speaking as was described in the commentary by Martin Cohen, as an oracle. So it's possible, I want to emphasize again, Ahuva's perspective, that it could be the Psalter imagining how God is now responding. I still, there's ambiguity. That's the power of these poems. And they are, poems and conversations with God. I tend to think here that, and again, I'm repeating just to clarify, that the Psalter is saying to the people around him, let me share with you what I learned from my experience, which is don't be like a horse or a mule. Know that you have the ability to make choices, not to be led. And in making that choice, it should lead you to confession before God. But that's part of the power. I don't think there's a right or wrong. It's two different ways of reading the psalm. And I'm delighted, Ahuva, that you bring to the foreground honoring that possibility of God's voice as resonant for you. I honor that. Any other reactions to this psalm, of which there's so much to say, as there are in all of these things? And that's because poetry, of course, particularly this psalm, has ellipses, kind of gaps or ambiguities that have led translators and commentators in different directions. Marian, go ahead.
Why the emphasis horse and mule? Mule being up, theoretically more stubborn, but is there a reason that both are put in there?
It's an interesting question, because we always have to underscore the merit of your question. In Psalms, every word is purposeful and chosen. Right. So one would ask, isn't that redundant? And I haven't seen it addressed in the commentaries I looked at, other than the fact that they're just two of the popular animals in the time of the psalmster. And it could be for emphasis. So sometimes it's repeated, but even though they're close, just to emphasize, don't be like these animals that are led around to stay in their place, so that you, and here's the other piece. This is fascinating. In verse 9, restrain so as not to approach you. That's how the King James Version understands it. It's how I chose to also understand it, as did others. But listen to how differently the Jewish Publication Society translates it. Whose movement must be curbed by bit and bridle, semicolon, far be it from you. Very, so again, you take the Hebrew, and I, again, just delight in the ambiguity of what the Psalter is saying. Other, a comment or a question? Richard.
Yeah, it seems as though part of the core of this is transgression, acts covered over. Yeah. And it almost, that's kind of something of the joy, or the foundation of the joy of what he's experiencing. And I could almost put verse 5 as the introduction and verse 1 as the second verse, sort of establishing the fact that he has been confessing his transgressions. They got covered over, and then the joy and happiness that is resulting from this. I'll leave it that to you.
All right, so let me share a reaction to Richard's insight, and that is verses 3 and 4 That's the description of his anguish, which again is powerfully described. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away from my roaring all the day. For day and night, your hand was heavy upon me. My sap was turned into the dry winds of summer. Selah. So this vivid description of suffering in silence, emphasizing Richard's focus on opening up, which is verse 5. My stray acts I made known to you, and my iniquity I did not cover up. I said, I shall confess my transgressions to Adonai, and you lifted the iniquity of my stray acts. So with that, let me pull this together. And that is, this is the Psalm of confessional, a psalm of rejoicing, of finding voice rather than silence, through trusting in God to be transparent, through the awareness of levels of wrongdoing, each admitted to God, that provides both joy and wisdom. And then the second part of the psalm is that of wisdom sharing, with the ambiguity of, is it him hearing God's voice teaching him? Or is it his voice, now that he has found voice, teaching his neighbors of the wisdom of confessional repentance and the living of life with calm contentment that comes with that honest living and honest voice. So with that, Psalm 32, which, by the way, 32 in Hebrew means lave, which is heart or mind. And in many ways, this is a psalm about finding wisdom through opening the heart. With that, I invite anybody who is in need of saying Kaddish to rise and to join together as we fulfill the mitzvah through saying Amen. Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, v'alma tivra kirute, v'yamlich malchute, v'chayechon u'vyomechon u'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kari v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevarach, le'olam olmei almayah, yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, V'yitadar, v'yitaleh, v'yitalal, shemei dekudsha b'richu, le'ela minkol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran b'yoma v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'yokol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Osei shalom b'rumav. Ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'yokol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen. Thank you again for sharing in Psalm 32. Blessings to all of Shabbat Shalom. It should all be well.